Chapter 16 brings together what we learned about file handling back in Chapter 10 and what we just learned about plotting data in Chapter 15. So we're going to kind of integrate those two technologies in Chapter 16. For the exercises in the book and some of the hands-on in this lesson, you are going to want to download the Chapter 16 zipped file and decompress it. For examples that I've created for the CSV files, this is the CSV file that I used. So if you want to copy paste the examples and run them on your system, you are going to need that file. So you can download that as well. The CSV files are basically Excel files that have been exported as comma separated value files. So instead of being in a spreadsheet with columns, they are in a text file with the data separated by commas. That's all they are. And you can pull them into your Python file using the import CSV statement that will pull in a module that allows you to interact with these files. The CSV library module has different functions that let you read the CSV files, but if you wanted to actually create a CSV file, you could do that as well. We are going to be looking at how to read the files because that is what we need to do to pull the data into Python so we can chart it. In order to read the file, we have to import CSV, and then we have to open the file. Opening the file works the same as opening a text file or any other kind of file. So we're going to use with open because that will automatically close the file. You have to tell it where the file is located, and then you have to kind of give the file an alias that you're going to work with in your program. And so we are calling our file, in this example, CSV file. And so you will notice that to access the data in the file, we are using the CSV reader. So it's csv.reader, and then in parentheses, it's whatever your file name is. And then you're telling it the delimiter is a comma, which just means that you have a comma between the different pieces of data. So basically, this is going to read the file into whatever variable you have defined. In this case, I'm calling it CSV_reader. And once you have the data in that variable, you can access the data. And one technique, this is a technique from the Python website. This technique uses a for-in statement and processes row by row. The very first row in a CSV file is the headers. Okay, if you think about what an Excel file looks like, you typically have a row of headings and then you have your data. So the first row is normally a header row. So basically, if the line count is 0, that means I'm on the first row, and we're going to print out the header so that we can take a look at it. You pretty much need to know the order that your data is stored. So printing out the header is kind of useful. And then also we're printing out the first line. And after that, we aren't printing out everything, especially in this example, because there's over 6,000 lines. So at the end, I am printing how many lines are in the file, so you can see that. So here's the sample output, and these are the column headings. And then this is the first row of data. So not only is it helpful to see, what the columns are, it's also helpful to see the format that the data is in. Okay, and then at the bottom here, you can see that there's over 6,000 lines in that particular file, which is also a good thing to know. So this just gives you information on the file. This example from the book is specifying the name of the file in a variable, and then we are opening the file using that name, the variable name, and the file pointer is given an alias of F. And so when we're using CSV Reader, we are basically using F here, which is the file pointer. And we're storing it in a variable called reader. Now, this little example is using the next method to read the first line. And that first line is being stored in a variable which we print out. So it's just a little different way of printing out the headings. So the next method itself is considered to be a looping method where you read the next line in the file. And you'd continue reading the next line until you reach the end of the file. Here is another little function called enumerate. So this is another way of processing that header file. What I like about enumerate is that it allows you to retrieve the index number and the value. And in order for you to access data in that CSV file, you do need to know what the index number is. So this is similar to the other example. It's just that the for in statement is using enumerate. And you can see that we're accessing the index and the column, and then we're printing that out. Okay, and we're only really printing that out for the first row. And then after that, we're printing out the first row of data and processing the lines or a line count. So here's what that looks like. And again, this is super useful to see. Knowing that the very first item in the header is given an index of 0 would allow you to just count, right? So this first item is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay, so here is another example from the book using the enumerate to access that same data. Now, when you read data in from a CSV file, you can store it in a list, which is how we just looked at it, right? This is in a list, Python list. You can also pull it in and store it as a dictionary object. The reader, CSV reader, automatically stores it as a list. If you wanted to pull it in and use store it as a dictionary object, you would use csv.dictReader, which is dictionary reader. Okay, and the rest of the processing would be similar, but what you would have stored in CSV reader would be dictionary lines instead of lists. So this would be the output if you used Dictionary Reader. So you can see that we have key value pairs here. Okay, so instead of a list, you'd be working with key value pairs. That would affect how you're going to access the data. The book is using the CSV reader, so that is what we are going to use as well. I just wanted to point out that you did have another option there. Accessing the data. You actually have to subscript in using the index number. So that is why knowing, what the headings are and figuring out what those index numbers are is critical to be able to access the data. So this little example, we're looking at foods again. And so we are reading the data in. So we've got an open, reading in the data. And we automatically access that first row. We're not going to really print it this time because we already know what's in there. We did that in another program. So we're just kind of getting it out of the way so that we can access the data. Okay, and then we do our for in loop. And you'll notice that I have several lists up here. This is the data that I want to chart. So I'm basically using the list.append and I'm subscripting in to the data row by row, and I'm pulling out the pieces that I need. Okay. Now, when I did this, I discovered that some of the data, instead of having a value, it had null. Well, that was kind of a problem, especially because the protein, fat, and carbs needed to be numbers, and null is not a number. So when I tried to access the data like this and convert it to a number using float, I got an error the first time it hit null. So what I did was a little if else, and I now check for null. And if it's null, I'm just putting a 0 in. And if it's not null, then I am retrieving that number and converting it into a float. Because if you look, everything in your CSV file, whether it is a number or text, is considered to be text. It's all in quotes. So to chart data, your numbers actually have to be numbers. So you're going to have to convert them. So this is how I did it. And I did the same thing with the fats and the carbs. I'm checking to see if the data that I'm accessing is null. If it is, I just put a 0 in. Otherwise, I access the number and I'm converting it to a number using float. So by the time it's done processing this loop, I have complete lists. And in this case, there's over 6,000 entries in each one. So once I got the complete lists from my file, the rest of the processing is what we've been doing in chapters 1 through 15. I ran into a little snafu because honestly, 6,000 items is way too many to chart. So what I ended up having to do is create some sub lists and I randomly retrieved items from the sub lists. And I probably should have had 6,400 here, but this is random enough. So I basically retrieved a number between 1 and 6,000 and then created some various temp lists. Another thing I ran into is that the text description for each food item was way too long, because that's what I have on my access for category labels, and it was way too long. So what I ended up having to do is randomly retrieve the food description, and then I just subscripted in basically and grabbed the first 15 characters. Okay, and that's what I ended up storing in my list and displaying in the chart. For everything else, I just randomly retrieved the item. Okay, and in this little example, I still randomly retrieve 5,000 items, which is a lot, but I'm doing a scatter chart, so that makes sense. If I was doing a bar chart or something like that, or a line chart, I might only retrieve 10 or 20. Okay, so it just depends on, what kind of chart you're doing. Okay, and then you can see that I kind of specified all of my values here. I did end up using the subplots because in a scatter chart where you've got all of these items, you don't really want anything on the x-axis. In fact, the x-axis looks like a mess if you're going to try to put 500 food items down there. So this basically suppresses that. So you don't have a bunch of text down there. You've got the tick marks, which I probably should have suppressed also, but you don't have your text down there. So what if I wanted to chart all 6,000 items? Well, you can't, it looks terrible in one plot to have, all three with 6,000 items. So what I did here was I did 3 separate plots in the figure, and I did one for each. And the scatter made sense, and so did doing the color maps. So this is just so you can see any kind of trends as far as when you're accessing food items, how much protein's in it, how much fat, how many carbs. You can see that carbs wins. So this is how I set up this one figure with 3 different plots. So you can pretty much plot any of the chart types using your CSV data. It just depends on, how much data you have and what you want to display. For the JSON files, you'll find when you are looking for data to download online that the large data sets are either going to be CSV files or they're going to be JSON files. And we already know how to process JSON files. We know how to create them and we know how to read data from them. So getting an online source is no different really than processing our own JSON file. The primary difference in an online source is that the file is a tad more complicated. So for reading and writing the files, the data that you find in a source like this, and I can actually display JSON files online. As you can see, this is not in a very user-friendly format for reading, or I call it a human readable format. And in order for you to access this data, you need to get it in a better format so you know what the key value pairs are. So this little example actually opens the file and it reads all of the data in to a variable. And then you are using that variable and you are writing out a file with the indent set to 4 so that you get it in a nice human readable format. Okay, that's all this is doing. And when you process your own JSON files, you are going to want to do this as well. Okay, so this is code you can actually copy, paste, and run. Once you have it in a format that allows you to read it, then you can open the file that you created and you will be able to access the data. So this is the file. Okay, so we're reading it in here. That's the file. And we are accessing the features, and we're storing that here. And then that allows us to go in and retrieve items. And you'll notice that we have some nested items in here. So that's why we've got properties and magnitude, geometry, coordinates. The first coordinate is your longitude. The second coordinate is your latitude. And once we retrieve the data, we can add it to our own lists. And once we get it in our own list, then we will be able to chart it. So this little for in loop is all about accessing the data that we have in the file and then appending it to our own list. And then just to make sure that the data was added to our list properly, we're basically printing out the first 10 magnitudes and then the first 5 longitude and latitude. So you can kind of see what those look like. So that's really all there is to retrieving that data and putting it into your list. Once you have it in the list, you chart it like anything else. So to create the chart, you either would use Matplotlib or Plotly, either one. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so I think the challenge that you're going to face using the JSON data is getting it into that human readable format. That's critical. And then figuring out, how to go in and access the data, especially because it's got nested listing, nested dictionaries. It's configured a little bit more complicated than what you're used to.